Hi, and welcome to Mike's V8 Garage. This time, having shown you rebuilding the engine on my Lexus GS, I think it's time I showed you what it's like to drive. As those of you who've watched my channel already will know, my daily driver is now a 2006 Lexus GS430. So it's a 4.3 litre V8 engine, a 6-speed torque converter automatic gearbox, and with the addition of LPG makes an entirely credible, economical enough daily driver. It's a 2006 model with 103,000 miles on the clock, so not particularly worn in for the type of engine car that it is, although there is a few niggles as you've seen in previous videos which I'm on my way sorting through now. But overall, having a car that's got 279 horsepower, 308 pound-feet of torque, and will do 0 to 60 in a verified by me close enough 5.9 seconds. Is quite interesting, and certainly it's a more interesting daily driver than you'd normally find. But most importantly, how does it drive? Well, let's find out. So as you get on the move, the first thing you notice about this car, and in fact it was the first thing I noticed on the test drive, is the sound, as in the complete lack of it. And although I'm not exactly piling along just now, the fact that there's pretty much no engine noise doesn't really change when you put your foot down either. There's the merest hint of a little V8 rumble when you press on a little bit, but it's only a hint, and it's something I'll come back to later. But one thing you can't complain about this car is the actual performance that it gives you. As said, 0 to 60 of 5.9, just under 280 horsepower, and over 300 pound-feet of torque. It hustles along the road quite nicely. And overall performance, raw performance, is one of the areas I'm most happy with this car. Where it starts to have some shortfalls, unsurprisingly, is in the overall ride and handling, and partly that's because firstly this car is notoriously softly sprung and softly damped. However, again surprisingly, it does grip and get around corners quite nicely. Helped by some really nice well-weighted steering. It's one of the real plus points of this car, but it's actually got a lot of mechanical grip, and it will stick and go around some surprising corners at some unexpected speeds. What it doesn't do though is give you a particular feeling of confidence when it's doing that, because it's got such a high degree of body roll. The damping you can get around, but the body roll is one of the big weaknesses of this car. Luckily, again, it's something I plan to sort out later. More on that to follow. But overall, that's the main weakness of this car, I think, is the overall suspension setup, allied to the chassis stiffness. As said, the curb weight's fairly low, and I think one of the areas where Lexus left a bit out to achieve that was in chassis rigidity. You can feel the car just moving around a little bit when you're cornering, and again it's something I want to look at, and I'll come to that later, is trying to just tighten it up a little bit without compromising the ride too much, which it shouldn't. So the engine gives decent performance. I've mentioned the gearbox already. It's an A761E 6-speed automatic gearbox, a torque converter, not a CVT. That would have been a bit of a deal breaker for me. I do not like those really. 6 ratios, so it's fairly flexible. In full automatic mode as I am now, it's not too bad actually. When you look at the character and nature of this car, it is a luxury coupe. It is not a sports car, and the gearbox suits it in that regard. What it does have a little bit of trouble with is when you start to press on, it'll sometimes get itself wrong-footed a little bit, and the changes are not particularly fast, but they're not particularly slow. So it is what it is. It's a reasonable box. It could be a bit faster, it could be a little bit quicker, but again, it's decent enough at what it is. And also again, there's things I can do to improve that. More on that later. There's a bit of a theme developing here. One thing that did disappoint me though when I got the car is it does have a sequential mode, so I've just put it into sequential. It's now dropped into 5th gear, down from 6th as it was cruising. And you can then use that to hold the gear and down change, and then 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and it will hold those gears. Unfortunately, what it won't do though is fix it into that gear. So I had it in 2nd gear there. What that basically means is the gearbox is holding you to no higher than 2nd gear. So I'm putting it in 5 now. That means it's got between gears 1 and 5 to choose from, and it will do, and it will still automatically shift between them. 4th, same thing, 1 to 4. 3rd, 1 to 3. You get the idea. So what it really allows you to do is just limit the engine's upper gears, and really the only point of that is if you're going down a steep hill or something like that and you want to bring engine braking into it, it just allows you to force the car into a lower gear and avoid having to use the brake all the way down a hill or something similar. The final point to mention in the overall kind of powertrain of this car is the brakes, which are actually quite decent. Certainly the 4-pot calipers up in the front, all aluminium, 4-piston as I said, and they give a decent feel, and they're not too bad for the weight of the car. They're perfectly adequate with decent pads and discs. The rears are single piston and steel, and are probably one of the weaker points on the car, mainly because they are slightly prone to seizing and just rusting up a bit. And again, that's something I'm in the middle of sorting just now, is properly refurbishing a set of calipers. The fronts are done already, you'll see that in a later video, and the rears I'm in the middle of doing now. And the reason the rears have taken a bit longer is exactly because of that rust. In summary, performance from that engine, unsurprisingly from a 4.3 litre V8, is excellent. And I won't talk about power adders. The gearbox is reasonable, and again can be zipped up a little bit to become good. The suspension is pretty much as expected, and with a little bit of work in the damping and especially the roll, will again be up to a really good standard to my tastes. The chassis is a little bit sloppy, but again with a little bit of work to brace that up, should come back into scale. And the brakes are overall decent. So it's an okay car, it is what it is, and with a little bit of tweaking I think it can be made so much better. There's a lot of potential in this that's just waiting to be tapped, I feel anyway. It'll just cruise along, it'll ride fine, and it's a perfectly comfortable daily driver, especially when you do quite high mileage, which I do, which is one of the reasons I got this. I think it's time to talk about all the I'll talk about that later bits I mentioned. So I didn't get this car just to drive as is. That's not me, unfortunately. The list of modifications that I'm intending to do is growing and growing and growing as I'm digging. So I'll just run through those in turn. Firstly, what I wanted to do is get this car properly mechanically sorted, and you've seen already the lengths I've had to go to with the engine to do that. But that, or at least getting seals, gaskets and all the rest of it fully renewed, was always on the cards. Same thing with refurbishing a full set of brake calipers, changing out the brakes pads and discs, and all of that other basic work. And that's still work I'm continuing with now. And once I've got all that kind of basic stuff done, I'll then move on to actually modifying. So I'll start with the engine. Normally the most obvious place to modify any car, the outright performance. It's actually a bit difficult with these. Lexus's ECUs are not particularly easy to get into, and because not many people want to modify their Lexus GS, the market just wasn't there. So the basic sort of remap that you would expect to get on any car, you can't really do on these without a piggyback ECU. And as a normally aspirated engine, the gains wouldn't be worth the expense of doing something like that outright. However, what you can do, you can stick an Eaton supercharger on there, or something similar. Basically, a root style supercharger can be fitted on one of these, and apparently doesn't need a remap to manage. So long as you keep it at around 4 pounds of boost, no more, the stock ECU can handle the extra fueling and air requirements and can adapt to it. More relevant is moving on to things like the gearbox. There is a revised valve body that you can fit on these gearboxes that'll make them change a lot quicker, and that's definitely on the cards along with a full flush and service, because it's about that time. The other thing you can do without having to perform major surgery in your gearbox is there's a selector switch on the body of the box that allows you to set the overall pressure, fluid pressure in the box itself, which determines how quickly it changes and so on. So normally for these, I believe it's set on either setting 1 or 2 from the softest through to the middle of the road. There's a further setting there which allows you to turn it up just a notch and get slightly snappier shifts. So that'll probably be first on the list because it's easily accessible. So the next area I want to deal with is the suspension overall, and I'm tying the chassis stiffness into that as well because it's all one and the same. So what I didn't say earlier is this car is already on aftermarket suspension. It's got a full set of Tyne or Teen Flex Z coilovers, which are adjustable for height and also adjustable for damping. Single adjustable only. They do jounce and rebound at the same time. And what it has allowed me to do is already set the height down just a little bit, but keeping the same rake front and rear as the original suspension, and also firm up the damping slightly. These coilovers are currently set on the mid-range, so there's 16-way adjustable damping. They're currently on setting 8, while I get used to them and just see how they handle. And I'll probably just stiffen them up slightly over that once I've got used to it. But overall, a definite benefit to any of these cars, and they have improved that wallowy ride quite significantly. In fairness to Lexus though, the original shocks were long past their best, so that probably didn't help. The next two things that go together is the roll bars and the chassis rigidity. As I've mentioned, one of my main issues with this car is the roll, and indeed also what I failed to mention in the handling side of things is this car has a real liking for hunting camber and tram lining, to the point where you can feel it shimmying and kind of schmoozing around on the road, especially if you're in a rutted motorway where lorries have been before. And my feeling is very strongly this is down to worn bushes and probably worn anti-roll bar bushes as well, coupled with an anti-roll bar that doesn't really have a strong enough rate on it, I feel. So to tackle that in order, the intention is to go for a set of F Sport anti-roll bars, which come with bushes as well, which will provide a stiffer rate bar and also renew the bushes at the same time. The question I'm looking at now is, Lexus doesn't really do bushes. Most of the aftermarket rubber bushes are quite frankly garbage, and I wouldn't put them in, which leaves either gritting my teeth and buying new suspension arms from Lexus, or going polybush. Now normally I wouldn't have thought of something like that because my view was it would have been too harsh for what the car's meant to be. But actually, I've done a bit of digging, and there's a set of 80 gyrometer, or whatever you want to call it, poly bushes that you can get for these cars that actually appear to be fairly compliant. So that is probably going to be on the cards, because I can do the entire car for about 450 or so pounds, just under 500 pounds. And that is a significant difference. And what it allows me to do is get all my arms out, clean them, paint them, sort them out, get the old bushes out, polybush and put them all back together, and then we're all good for an absolute fraction of the price. So more on that to follow once my bank account's recovered. At the same time, there's adjustable camber arms in the rear that you can get, and also bushes in the front upper arms that allow you to adjust caster forward from where it is. So again, looking at those, dependent on cost, dependent on whether I feel it's necessary once I've got the tram lining and all the rest of it sorted out, that's something I might be looking at in the future. So the final part of the whole suspension piece I'm talking about is the chassis. As I said, it's a fairly flexible chassis. It's noted for a degree of flex and movement when you're driving. Certainly that's something I've noticed. So luckily there is a decent range of aftermarket braces, both top and bottom, steering rack braces, all sorts of things you can fit on. So I'm going to progressively work through those until I'm happy with the car. Probably an upper strut tire brace, a lower front brace for the subframe and also for the steering rack, and then a rear lower brace. There is an upper brace that can fit in the rear to lock those shock towers together, but that would mean cutting holes and compromising boot trim and boot space. So I don't want to do that straight off. I'd rather see what the initial effect is of the others. As I said, I'm not turning this into a track car. I just want to get a decent handling daily. So we'll see where we go with those, but that's the kind of long-term plan for that. So the final area I'm looking at modifying is the sound. I've referred enough times to this thing being quiet, and you've probably noticed or not noticed the exhaust note as I've been doing this video. And luckily there's a fairly easy option, because this is an extremely muffled system. From the engine you've got fairly restrictive headers. That's something I'm not going to change because it's too much effort. Behind them, a set of fairly lumpy catalytic converters. They then join into a single pipe where it goes to the rear, where there is inline another catalytic converter and a resonator, before it then splits back out into two fairly large silenced back boxes. So when you add all of that together, you can't really hear much. And this car, I didn't mention earlier, has a small hole in the Y pipe at the back box. So actually this is louder than stock. Not that you'd notice. So the plan for that is to work my way back. There's a decent back box you can get for these cars. It's a Top Speed Pro 1, I think it is, that gives a nice deeper tone and a little bit more volume. If that proves insufficient, the next step is to progressively remove the third cat, then the resonator and straight pipe, that midsection, which appears to give a really nice V8 rumble without droning and without being too loud. So when you add all of these things together, what I should have is an economical V8 daily driver that shifts well, handles well, stays steady to a line on the road, doesn't have significant chassis flex, but is still a comfortable ride. Not much to ask for, I don't think. But as said, there's options that exist everywhere to do all of those things. And as time and money allow, that's what I'm going to be working through in the coming year. So to finish off, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving me a like down below. It helps a lot with the analytics and just getting this video visible and viewed. If you want to see more of what I do and where this car ends up going, and also the other two cars I've got, then consider subscribing. But overall, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.